Okay, dear friends, good evening. I'm really glad to see you all here. My name is Alexander Akimenko. I'm an academic director of the Master Program on Innovation and Entrepreneurship, and welcome to the Ukrainian Catholic University Business School. We are really glad to have this event today. Let me tell a bit about the context of this event. I've been taking Linda's class in 2016 at Stanford University. It was a long time ago, but the methods that she is teaching is actually works because these methods actually helped me to invite her here, actually, and this is the proof that the methods actually of negotiation actually work. So let me introduce our guest today, Linda Netsch. She is a lecturer on law at Harvard Law School. She has been teaching the class on negotiation for more than 20 years at Harvard Law School, and also in other universities like Stanford, and also she's been teaching at Berkeley Haas Business School for business students, and she's been teaching to the corporate world with different companies around the world. And she's also a mentor in San Francisco-based incubator Plug and Play Tech Center. And also she's an angel investor into startups, primarily early stage startups in a investment company called Golden Seeds. And also she works as a lawyer at a Fenwick company. Join me in welcoming Linda Netsch to the stage. And Thank you, Linda, for coming here. And I want to remind that this particular event is actually dedicated to the fund of Oleg Vorobyov, our student who was killed in the front line, and all the generous donation that you've made to buy the ticket to this event went to this fund. So thank you, Linda, for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you here in Ukraine, in Lviv. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming tonight, for inviting me. It's a privilege to be here with you. I greatly appreciate the opportunity to come talk with you tonight. I do hope that this session is one that is helpful for you in terms of, please feel free to ask questions, to share comments, to share experiences. I know I'm in a room of people who have a lot of negotiation experiences, not to mention interesting life experiences right now. So to whatever degree you want to participate and engage, I welcome the opportunity to speak with you and have a dialogue tonight. So when Sasha asked me to do this presentation, particularly with an eye toward what are useful negotiation skills for entrepreneurs, I thought about this book that came out. Actually, the reason I thought about it is I saw it on my bookshelf from years ago. And it's called What They Don't Teach You at Harvard Business School. And it was written by a guy who was a very famous business guy. He's actually kind of the founder of sports management and sports talent. He sold his company for nearly $3 billion, I believe, not sure the number, in 2013. Is one of the most successful business people in the United States, and particularly when this book was published, which is 1984, I believe. The idea was they don't teach you enough practical skills at a place like Harvard Business School. You've got to learn what it's like to be a real negotiator or a real business person. And you've got to understand people, and you've got to understand perspectives, and you've got to understand how to influence. But I would argue, if I can advance the slide, I don't think it's going forward yet. Well, let me tell you what I would argue regardless. So there was a book published actually a couple years before this book called Getting to Yes. Anyone read Getting to Yes or even heard of Getting to Yes? Yeah? It was, you've heard of it. There it is. So Getting to Yes was published by a lawyer at Harvard Law School, Roger Fisher, who was I believe, World War II veteran, and he got very interested in that experience about how to negotiate to resolve disputes as opposed to what was happening at that time. So this book was actually kind of a foundational book. It's still on the business, if I'm correct, on the Business Week bestseller list from 1981 or whenever it was published. And this book is very much about practical, real-life application of business and negotiation skills, oddly enough, at the law school. But it was the foundation for the Harvard Negotiation Project, which is still a very active organization at the law school. I took in my first, okay, maybe I should back up a second and say, yeah, I did take a class in negotiation my first year of law school from Roger Fisher. And I didn't even realize at the time the profound effect it would have on my life, because as a law student, first year law student, I wasn't quite aware of how powerful some of these ideas were. They just seemed kind of like common sense to me. But and I should say, it's translated into just about every language that I'm aware of, including I saw the other day in Ukrainian, I believe. So let me back up and say, well, how did I end up here? So very early in my career, I started out as an Air Force officer, and I was stationed at Ramstein. I understand you all know where that is. And I had just graduated from college. I had an undergraduate degree in molecular biology. So, of course, the military decided that I should be a communications integration engineer. What that has to do with genetics and molecular biology, I'm not sure, but the military is nothing if not flexible. So I was sent to 9 months of communications electronics engineering school in Mississippi, and then I ended up in Germany at Ramstein Air Base. And my job as a very young officer was to go around Western Europe to NATO countries and facilities, NATO allies, and negotiate around installing satellite communication systems and network communication systems for passing intelligence to pilots. Way back then, there were very few satellites up, and there was a lack of real-time information for pilots to get intelligence, and so that was my job. And it involved going around to bases. It involved negotiating with local nationals, with military people, obviously, with defense contractors. Boeing, Lockheed, Harris would come over and talk to us about their systems. And I realized at that time that I was a bit over my head, but I was getting a lot of real-life experience in negotiation without a lot of formal training in what are the best practices. I went back to the States after a couple of years in Germany. I had a NATO job there where I was going back to Brussels, kind of continuing negotiations. But then I had the opportunity to go to law school, and I ended up at Harvard Law School, which probably looks about like this right now. I think there's still plenty of snow on the ground. And I took the class. And again, as I said, I think I realized at that time that this material is helpful, but you've got to put it into practice. You've got to actually put these ideas into practice in a practical way. And I left the experience thinking, yeah, again, I'm not sure. I liked it better than my torts class or constitutional law. So it was a fun experience in that way. But I didn't really realize how it would affect my personal and professional career afterwards. There are a lot of not very attractive buildings at Harvard Law School, but this one's nice looking, so I figured I'd show the good one. And by the way, that building behind the sign is where the Harvard Negotiation Project is. I just finished my 23rd year in a row of teaching there. I teach in January. I live in Silicon Valley, but I go to Boston in January to appreciate living in Silicon Valley, because Boston in January is not the most pleasant place weather-wise. But it gives me the opportunity, the students at Harvard Law School, and it's not, by the way, just law students, it's also the School of Business, Kennedy School of Government, Tufts University, usually has a lot of international students from other countries that are practicing lawyers that come there to take the class, and they're part of an LLM master's program in law. This January, the students included people from Saudi Arabia, Israel, India, Pakistan, France, Belgium, Austria, China. So it's a very diverse, very experienced group of people, really fun, kind of like working here with the group I've been working with in Ukraine. Smart, engaged, thoughtful, impactful people. And I was walking around Cambridge this January, and I had never noticed this before, but this is the Ukrainian Research Institute, which is right outside of Harvard Yard, and I think people are paying more attention to it than ever right now. All right, so what do they teach you at our law school that is practical for entrepreneurs, business people, basically anyone who negotiates, which is everyone? If we define negotiation this way, that negotiation is essentially back and forth communication aimed at reaching an agreement that satisfies the interests of the negotiating parties, if you think about that definition, it's very broad. You're doing it all the time, whether you call it a negotiation formally or not. You're doing it at home. You're doing it in the business world internally with your colleagues and folks on the same side of the table as you, and also with vendors, contractors, lawyers, whoever you interact with externally. And so the helpful thing about defining negotiation is it helps you be more strategic and thoughtful when you are doing it in the real world. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on frameworks tonight, but in terms of what we actually work with and talk about in the course, that's what I'd like to spend a bit of time with tonight and open it up for some questions and thoughts that you might have about this particular framework and some of the things we really emphasize in the class. Again, the class that I teach is typically 3 weeks long, all day, every day, 4-credit course for law students, but the diversity and experience level of the students is very advanced. This is the model, 7 elements of negotiation, again, very much part of the Getting to Yes framework. But to simplify it and not spend too much time on it, it's important in any negotiation to pay attention to these 7 aspects of negotiation. The communication and relationship piece, obviously very important. How well are you building trust and rapport with the other side or not? And what impact is that having on your ability to develop creative solutions in your negotiation? So in any negotiation, I have my interests, you have yours. We put those together into different options. We choose among possible options with standards of legitimacy, or another way to think about that is what are the market norms, standards, criteria that are at play that help define what's fair or reasonable in a negotiation. And after the process of having that back and forth conversation, we either walk to our alternative or we commit to a deal with the other side. Simply put, anyone heard the term BATNA? Does anyone know what that is? Yeah? Best alternative to a negotiated agreement. And what does that mean?
It means that at the beginning, as I understood it,
yeah.
So it means that at the beginning of the negotiation, I should understand what is the best achievable negotiation result is for me. But in terms of some losing, thank you. In terms of probably losing something, so what are the key points, as I understood, for me in negotiations?
Yeah, I think so. You're exactly right. It's the best alternative to a negotiated agreement, and the idea is, what if you can't reach a deal that satisfies your interest? What's the best choice you have that you can do without the other party? So if I'm buying a car and I'm not happy with the dealer price at that particular dealership, my BATNA, my best alternative, might be to go to a different dealer, or to buy a used car, or take public transportation, right? It's the things that you can do that do not require a yes from the other side. And conceptually, that's helpful because we often don't think thoroughly about both what we will do if we have to walk and what they will have to do if they walk. So if you want to use normal human language, it's your walk away. What are you going to do if you walk away? But if you're hanging out with negotiation people, use the term BATNA, and they'll know you're up on the literature about negotiation. It's surprising how that was a concept that wasn't very much talked about all the time now, whether they use the word or not. But thinking through what you'll do if you walk and what they will do if you walk is a helpful concept to keep in mind as you're preparing for and conducting your negotiation. So that's a framework we spend a lot of time on. And then we also talk about 3 common tensions in negotiation. The tension between creating value and distributing value. That is the notion of how can you make deals that have more interests satisfied? How do you expand the pie, so to speak? And we also know that you eventually have to decide who gets which slices. That's distributing value. You can think about it also as creating value and claiming value, but the notion that both of these things are at play in negotiation, and they are sometimes in tension, and you have to be skillful around both in order to be the most effective negotiator. I'll give some examples in a minute. The second tension is empathy and assertiveness, kind of fancy words for are you good at listening and are you good at speaking up for yourself? And those 2 skills can be in tension. If I'm focused on you and understanding your interests and understanding what you're trying to achieve, I might sometimes do that without taking care enough of my own interest, not being assertiveness. I think there's a bigger problem usually in the world at being good at assertiveness, but not quite as skillful around understanding the perspective of the other side, and that's the empathy piece. And then thirdly, I won't spend a lot of time on that tonight, but especially since I work with a lot of lawyers, but it's true for business folks as well, is there's often a difference in the interests around the principles and the agent representing those principles. So the client and the lawyer, the business and the business manager, or the business employee, sometimes our interests are not well aligned, and that can cause tension in a negotiation as well. All right, so I think most people think of lawyers. Well, I don't know. What do most people think of lawyers? It's not probably the favorite occupation in the US regardless, but there's a lot of assumptions that what you learn in law school is about fighting hard for your client's interest or your interest. You're good at the distributing value part of negotiation, of making sure you get the biggest slice you can get for yourself of that pie that has been expanded. Because that's a lot of what lawyers are taught about, how to argue, how to assert, how to advocate, we spend a lot of time in the negotiation class having them exercise a creating value muscle, if you will, and spending more time on how do you do that? What does it actually mean in practical terms to create value? Okay, so here's an exercise we do kind of early on in the first week of the course. Again, it's 3 weeks. We sort of divide the course, and the first week is creating and distributing value, empathy and assertiveness in week 2, and principal agent in week 3. But all the weeks blend together really when you think about how these skills come together in negotiation. But we do an exercise, I think it's typically the second day. They've already done an exercise where they explore competition, collaboration, and negotiation. But here's the exercise, and I'd like you to guess what the results are. So it would be, I won't make you do it, but imagine you're 144 law students, and we ask you to pair up with the person sitting next to you to assume the arm wrestling position, as you just saw, and there are no talking, right? That's the rules, no talking from now on. Your goal is to get as many points for yourself as possible, and the way you get a point is when your counterpart's, the back of your counterpart's hand touches the table that's in between the two of you, right? Classic arm wrestling. But there's no talking, you have to close your eyes, and it's 20 seconds. So if those are the rules, how many points do people get? 0? Why do you say 0? Okay, so they'll just be in a standoff. Okay, zeros. There are definitely some zeros. Any other guesses as to, I mean, obviously there's a lot of different results, but.
Both parties can get maximum points.
Let the other party to win. So you're thinking about, can you do something like this? How do you signal that? No talking, eyes closed. And by the way, when you see something like this, what assumptions do you make about what this exercise is? It's a competition, right? It's fighting the other side. I'm stronger than you, or you're stronger than me, and one of us will win, depending on who's the strongest. The assumptions are built in that this is a competition. And that's why most people get 0 or 1. It's a fun exercise to run. It's one that makes me very nervous at a law school in case something went wrong. But typically you'll see a range of people, and we had them close their eyes because there are definitely people that are stuck in the arm wrestling while some of their peers have figured out that you can go back and forth. How do you initiate, though? How do you initiate the back and forth if the other side hasn't thought about it? It's one thing if you both came into it thinking, I know this game, we can both win. How do you signal to the other side, this could be different? Yeah, please.
You can start pulling to your side, so you can take a step forward and not to win him or her, but to let him or her win first.
Great, so and that's disarming, right? Send something that people don't expect as a signal that this isn't what you think it is, this isn't just a fight, I'm actually going to give you a point right now. Were you thinking of something similar? Same idea, okay. And that's part of the challenge in even exercises like this or real life negotiation. Not everyone is entering a negotiation thinking we can collaborate and win-win. There's often a different assumption about what negotiation is. Negotiation is competition. That's what we have to do here, and I have to be stronger than you in order to win. So part of what we explore in working with these students, the business students, law students, actually practicing business people and lawyers, entrepreneurs of all sorts, is the negotiation a competition or is it collaboration? And the real answer is it's both. Most every negotiation has both opportunities to create value, right? Make the pie bigger, if you will. Still haven't figured out why it's a pie, but nonetheless, make the deal better for both sides. And at the end of the day, typically you've got to decide who gets which portion of it, right? What value is claimed by the parties in the negotiation. And that being good at balancing that tension is a key skill for any negotiator. Whether you're a business person, a government person, whether you're a professional or educator, knowing how you can both protect your own interests and do well for yourself, but also make deals that are better is a key aspect of practical negotiation skills. So again, we do spend time on, well, how do you effectively advocate? How do you effectively divide the pie? But I'd like to spend more time tonight because we actually do spend a lot of time with the students, having them think through how do we create value, not just fight over which piece of the pie, but how do we build better deals that better satisfy both sides? And if you think about often typical haggling negotiation, this is again Pareto, who's an Italian economist. Any of you who know the 80-20 rule might be familiar with his work as well. But the Pareto frontier is a conceptual concept, and that frontier is the point beyond which a deal can't be made better for one side without harming the other. That's the frontier. Most deals, though, actually look more like this. So person A says, I offer you, person B, this deal. It's really good for me, not so great for you. Person B then counters with, oh no, how about this deal, which is better for me, not as good for you, and we haggle around to the middle somewhere. I think that's how a lot of us think about negotiation. It's that sort of bargaining, haggling thing where we stake out our positions and move to the middle. The idea of creating value is, are there deals that actually could capture more value for both sides? And again, when you get to the frontier, the deal can't be made better for one without harming the other. It's very, very rare that we get to that theoretical Pareto frontier. And part of the challenge is, whether you're a lawyer, a business person, a government person, are you thinking about ways of making deals better for both sides, particularly if long-term relationships matter? And I would challenge you to think about how many negotiations in your own life are purely short-term. One-off transactions, You're never going to see that person again. You don't care about their interests. I think there are very few of those compared to the other negotiations we have, where it actually is very important for us to understand the other side, satisfy their interest to some degree, and get deals that preserve the long-term possibility of working together in the future. Okay, so that's the notion of value creation. Position versus interest. So here's a simple example of kind of famous story from negotiation literature. Two kids, the difference between positional bargaining and interest-based bargaining. Two kids fighting over an orange. Each child says, each child's position is the orange belongs to me. If you're a parent, how do you solve this problem? One orange, two kids, cut it in half, right? Give half to each child. It's the logical solution to the problem. So in this story of negotiation, one child takes the fruit and eats it, throws the peel away. The other child takes theirs half, throws the fruit away, and uses the peel to flavor a cake. This is a child that watches too much food television, but nonetheless, it works for a story. That if you better understood the positions, the interest behind the position, you could do a deal that creates more value. More fruit for one, more peel for the other. And while it's a simple example, it's surprising to me in my own life and professional work how often this plays out in real life examples where people are arguing over positions without really getting behind them to what is actually most important to the parties at the negotiating table. The better you get at that skill, the better you get at building deals that create more value for both sides in the negotiation. Okay, so again, to reiterate, positions are about haggling typically, not necessarily the underlying interests, motivations that could be satisfied in a variety of ways. Yeah, you can cut the orange in half, but there's another solution which moves out toward that Pareto frontier that's better for both sides. So the advice is just be aware of that and be more strategic and more thoughtful about thinking about what interests you have, not just the obvious ones. Money's almost always an interest if money's at play, but there are often other things besides money that matter, and the more you think about your own interests besides finances and the other side's interests besides finances, the more opportunities can come alive for doing deals that are better for both sides. I mean, it's not, again, not rocket science, but it's amazing when we're in the heat of a negotiation where there is competition, we lose sight of that. If you think about you're going to get a new job, salary matters to you, but what else might matter? The team you're going to be working with? Sorry? Challenge. Yeah, I'm going to be challenged here. Location. Work schedule. Work location, remote or not. Opportunities for advancement. Work-life balance. Free coffee. Child care. Do they have a gym? In the US, do you have health insurance? Since we don't know how to provide health insurance to the citizens of the country, right? So there are a lot of things that might motivate you within the context of a negotiation that are not purely financial interests. And the more we think about our negotiations in general as having multiple different interests, the better we become at negotiating. I think another thing we sometimes lose sight of is thinking about different resources and capabilities. And if we want to get simplistic about that, that is, what do I have that you want that's of value to you? And what do you have that I want that's of value to me? Particularly in situations where things that are not expensive to me that I can easily give up that are valuable to you, or vice versa, things that you have that aren't costly for you to give up that I need, that's a real source of value creation as well. And I've got a couple of stories to illustrate that. And bottom line is, one of the ways you figure this out, what are the interests that motivate the other side, is to ask more questions. I think that we don't tend to have an instinct to ask more questions, and not only ask the first question, but ask the follow-on question and make sure that you're paying attention to the answer. All right, story time. This is one of my favorite stories of value creation, and I would argue it illustrates the skill of the negotiator in looking for interests beyond the obvious interests. So Oceanside, California is a city on the ocean, not surprisingly, south of Los Angeles. It's heavily dependent on its beaches for tourism and tax revenue. A number of years ago, the city of Oceanside was negotiating the city contract for garbage hauling services in Oceanside. Now, so it's a government contract to pick up and haul away garbage. So I'm not sure how it is here, but what do you assume the assumption is about a government contract? Who wins government contracts? Cheapest price, right? That's sort of the assumption around government contracts. Low-cost bidder wins the deal. In this case, the woman who negotiated the contract had an offer that was $5 more per ton than her nearest competitor, which, and if you're talking about tons of garbage, that's actually a lot of money. And I would argue the way she was able to do that is that she was very curious about a broader set of interests besides the obvious one on the table. She was a surfer, apparently, and had spent time in Oceanside, and she knew that at the time that this contract was being negotiated or put up for bid, that Oceanside was having a pretty serious beach erosion problem. So they were losing a lot of sand on their beaches, and that was a problem for the city at the time. And you might be thinking, who cares? What does that have to do with garbage hauling services? But I think the fact that she was aware of this other issue motivating the city of Oceanside was how she got the contract. Any ideas how? That's exactly what it was. So one thing, so there was an Arizona-based garbage hauling company. One low-cost resource that the Arizona landfill had was sand. And so they put into the contract, we'll haul the garbage out, we'll dump it, we'll clean out the trucks, we'll fill it up with clean sand, and we'll bring it back to help with a beach restoration project in Oceanside, California. Because she understood that interest, she built that into the deal. It was of value to the city of Oceanside, and that's how they got the contract. You don't find those kinds of solutions unless you're curious about a broader set of interests. Okay. Warby Parker. Anyone? Who's heard of Warby Parker? Anyone? So they actually were a big online eyeglasses disruptor back in 2010 in the US. They actually just went public, I think it was last year, which is a terrible time to go public in the United States market, by the way. But Warby Parker was two guys, actually four original founders, at Wharton Business School. They were getting their MBA, and one of their projects was to figure out a business. So they were both frustrated with how expensive eyeglasses were in the US. And so what they wanted to do was have high quality, high style, low cost glasses that you could order online and have delivered to you at a fraction of the price of what people were paying to go to an eye doctor. So they launched this business while they're still in business school. They were also really skilled. They had relationships with publications like Vogue and GQ, so good publicity connections. And they were getting a lot of press in those magazines and digital forums while they were launching the business. The business launched while they were still in school, and it blew up in terms of popularity. They sold out immediately. Then they had orders for thousands and thousands more glasses that they couldn't fulfill, and they didn't have money for adding to their inventory. So they tell a story about how they were trying to get more money. Now that they had this huge demand, how do we actually get money to buy inventory and launch and help the business grow? And they went to 18 different banks in the United States trying to get a loan. No one of all 18 banks would give them a loan, despite their proven record so far, because they didn't have 2 years of tax records. So, okay, what's our plan B to negotiating with banks? They went to the government, the Small Business Administration, And they eventually did get a loan for $200,000, but they had to sign paperwork that was about that thick, including an agreement that they would not open a zoo. Now, that's kind of government bureaucracy in loaning money to a small business administration, but that's how they got that amount of money, but that wasn't enough for what they needed. And this is where I think they got very creative in trading off of resources. They had a distributor that they were working with who really liked them. And the distributor knew that they were having trouble with cash flow and said to them, you know, we like being your distributor, we like your product, we would want to see Warby Parker grow. So we heard you guys are really good at publicity. Our distribution company really needs publicity. So how about you consult with us on how to get better publicity for our company, and we'll pay you $200,000. And they said, okay, deal. Now, it's low cost to them because they have the skill in the marketing already. It's high value to the distributor, and it's one where the two parties were able to come up with a deal trading off those differences in resources and capabilities. This guy is Ralph Pace, Dutch originally, I think. As a kid, he moved to Canada and then the US. He is a licensing partner at Fenwick & West, the law firm where I work. I met Ralph when he and I were both teaching a class in negotiation at Stanford Law School. And so we're kind of teaching the same material. Ralph is a really skilled technology lawyer. Fenwick & West is a technology and life sciences law firm. They incorporated Apple back in the day. They did the WhatsApp acquisition by Facebook, early Uber people, you know, that kind of law firm. Very much tech and life sciences. Ralph, and it's in Silicon Valley, so it's very much the tech scene, but it's also lots and lots of different startups. It's also a very expensive law firm, as any of them are, when you're hiring a partner like Ralph and an associate to do your work. On the order of, let's say, $1,000 and up an hour for legal work by this particular firm. And that's the norm. So if you think about a startup business, how you afford that quality of legal representation is hard. And around the time of the crash after 2008, 2010, there was a lot of pressure around reducing fees, particularly around law firms working with startups in Silicon Valley. So one of the things around creativity in law firms was that law firms had to figure out how to be able to satisfy their clients in different ways. How do you know, when you don't know how many hours it's going to take and it costs $1,000 an hour to get work done, that can be disorienting. And some projects actually can be predicted. So law firms worked on flat fee kinds of arrangements in order to have something more predictable for clients. For startups in particular that don't have cash flow, the idea of deferred billing, it's kind of the norm now, but things like the first $30,000 is free, and then there's deferred billing up to your first financing event. Those are ways that law firms got creative around meeting the interests of startups that actually couldn't afford some of the legal fees that are incurred in starting up a tech company. But here's where I think Ralph, in particular, I remember having lunch with him when he had this idea about Flex by Fenwick. And if you think about interests of two parties, law firm has an interest in maintaining or gaining clients and not losing clients. Particularly, you know, startups can use the deferred billing, get growing, their investors might fund some of their money. But then once you've got a business going and you're signing contracts and you're doing the day-to-day legal work, you can't afford, and it doesn't make sense to be paying a partner in a law firm to be reviewing contracts that are your daily commercial contracts. You need an in-house lawyer whose price point typically is much less. So the firm wants to maintain, you know, the problem that they saw was we have these startups, they're very promising, maybe unicorns. We get them to we do their initial documents, we get them on the ground, we help them with financing, and then they need in-house lawyers, so they go to other resources. They go to small boutique law firms, they go hire in-house counsel, they use staffing agencies. So we lose that relationship when the client moves on to a different legal resource. Is there a way we can hold on to those relationships and help these clients as they need in-house legal support, particularly before they want to hire their first lawyer? They also didn't want to dilute their own fee structure. Law firms like their fee structure. It works well for them, but you shouldn't have your outside law firm doing your day-to-day legal contracting. And secondments, I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of secondment. A secondment is when a client says, we law firm want you to provide an associate to come work at our company for 6 months. It's usually a great experience, and secondments can be very helpful for young associates. The problem is for relatively small firms like Fenwick, it's very expensive to give up your associate to have them go work for free or a much reduced fee within a startup. So it wasn't a great idea for them to just send their young associates there. What do the clients want? They want more predictable, lower cost pricing that they can then use as they grow their business. So that was the idea behind Flex by Fenwick. What Flex does is we go out and we recruit and test and source and interview lawyers that have had experience both in law firms and in companies, tech and life sciences companies, who now are more interested in a flexible lifestyle. They want exposure to different kinds of clients. They're interested in having opportunities. Many lawyers are lousy at business development and getting new clients for themselves. So many lawyers are interested in working for interesting clients on a flexible schedule. So Flex by Fenwick is a way of taking the firm's interest in maintaining these relationships and the client's interest in more predictable legal fees, and putting together lawyers and clients. So, and in terms of negotiation, I actually was a consultant. I had a consulting business, still do, for years. And when Ralph was starting Flex by Fenwick, I spent a lot of time talking about it. I thought it was creative. It actually was the only AmLaw 100 law firms in the US that had such a service. Typically, services like this that are providing temporary in-house counsel are outside of a law firm. They're staffing agencies. This is one within a law firm that's actually providing lawyers. I worked with Flex as a client for a number of years, and then got a little bit tired of traveling constantly, and Ralph and I had a negotiation where he asked would I like to run Flex, which is what I'm doing now. Okay, so back to where are we? What are we talking about in terms of essential skills for negotiators and entrepreneurs? Getting really creative about thinking about interests and different ways of satisfying interests with options that are better for both sides is as important as knowing how to advocate strongly for your own point of view and what size of the pie you get for yourself. The second and related tension is between empathy and assertiveness. And I'm just for fun, if we define empathy as the ability to understand somebody else's point of view and prove that you understand that point of view, and assertiveness is the ability to very clearly articulate your own point of view and advocate for your own interests. If you had to choose, how many of you think my strong suit is advocacy, advocating for my own interests? No one? Couple folks? How many of you think my strong suit is empathy, understanding other people's points of view? A few more? Some of you are saying, I'm not going to say either way. I think it's interesting. What about lawyers? Better at advocacy or better at empathy? Or assertiveness or empathy? It depends. That's a lawyer's favorite phrase. It depends. Yeah, well, the truth of the matter is we all know how to do them. One of them tends to be our stronger suit. Some people are very good at empathy, really good at understanding other people's points of view, good at active listening, that kind of thing. but not so strong on the speaking up for themselves. Other people are comfortable on the advocacy, speaking up for themselves as their client, but not as strong on really understanding the other people's points of view. And so it's not that one is good and one is bad. It's much like creating and distributing value. They're both important. And can you get a balance that allows you to both protect your own interests, but also make the other side feel like you are treating them fairly or understanding what they need to achieve? I think that the listening skills, I think a lot of us think we're empathetic, but don't know exactly what the skills are that make one an empathetic person. It's not just sympathy. It's not just I can get you. It's much more of, can you help the person you're talking to, negotiating with, believe that you understand them or believe that you understand their point of view. So this was a study done a number of years ago in the UK. And what the study involved was, it took a group of labor management negotiators, so people who negotiate for a living, right? Collective bargaining agreements, wage and hour disputes, people that were very experienced negotiators, and they looked at what were the behaviors of the most highly skilled negotiators, those that got good deals for their constituents that actually lasted and people complied with, versus those that tended to be more average in terms of their results and durability of their deals. And the interesting results of that were that the highly skilled negotiators asked twice as many questions as their average counterparts. And those were open, curious questions, not questions like, why are you such a control freak? That is not an open question. It is a statement wrapped in a question mark. So the open questions are the, why is that important to you? Could help me understand what your goals are. What is important to you in us doing this deal, right? Just the open questions where you're showing curiosity about the other side's point of view. And skilled, this is, I believe, the most underrated and underappreciated verbal skill in negotiation, and that is good summarizing or paraphrasing skills. Can you put what the other side has told you into words that show you understand them to their satisfaction? Are you able to paraphrase or summarize? So I'm a big believer in this. Why? What's the value of summarizing or paraphrasing?
You're being aligned, you both know that you're on the same page.
You both know you're on the same page. Yeah, and I think too often in negotiations, you and I might be negotiating and say, okay, yeah, that's what we'll do, and then we walk away from the table, and we had totally different understandings about what we just agreed to. I'm sure everyone in this room has experienced that. Leave a meeting, everyone said yes, and very different understandings about what you actually said yes to. Summarizing or paraphrasing helps you make sure that you are aligned when you leave the negotiation. What else?
To be sure that you hear right.
Be sure that you hear right. Yeah. The other thing is, if I paraphrase you and I say, okay, so you think this, and this A, B, and C are important, and you say, no, A and B aren't important, no, it's C that I care about. Well, good thing that I tried to paraphrase, because I would have left there thinking you wanted A, B, and C, whereas the real important issue was C only. So paraphrasing is a way to make sure that you correct misunderstandings that otherwise the parties might not have corrected.
Yeah, basically you translate what they say on your own language.
Exactly. You translate what if I'm paraphrasing you, I say what you intended to communicate in my own words. And I think a lot of people are resistant to this because they're worried about looking like you're parroting. Parroting and paraphrasing are two different things. What's parroting?
Repeating the same.
Repeating the same. Right? We could do that back and forth a lot, right? I think this. Oh, so you think that. Yeah, I just said so. Parroting exactly the same words often feels more like you're just mimicking what the other party says. Skilled paraphrasing is actually taking what they said and saying, okay, this is what I understand, is that right? And if the other side says, yeah, you got it, then they both believe that you listened to them because you were able to paraphrase them. And if you got it wrong, they can correct you. If you got it right, then at least you're aligned in what your understanding is. So when you think about essential skills in negotiation, especially if you're going to find out what the interests are, think about open questions, the inquiry piece, summarizing or paraphrasing, and then also you've got to be able to speak up on your own behalf, right? Be clear about what your own interests are. It's rarely helpful when the other side can't figure out what you want in a negotiation. Often you won't have it met if you don't speak up. So ask more questions and be clear in your own assertions. Kind of fundamentally important skills for being successful in negotiations. Okay, I'm going to pause. Any questions, comments, pushback? Please.
About mirroring.
Mirroring, yeah. What is mirroring?
Reflecting or asking. It's like almost repeating the same thing, and like reflecting what you just said, and so to push you to present new evidence.
Yeah, well, so here's how I think about mirroring. So the danger of paraphrasing, there's several reasons why people don't paraphrase. They're worried it's going to look like just pure parroting. So I say, I want X, Y, and Z. Oh, you want X, Y, and Z, right? Seems too much like you're just being a mimicker of what they said. I think there's also a fear around paraphrasing that if I say, oh, so you think this is how the contract should be structured, that it will be interpreted as agreeing. It doesn't have to, right? I think you can easily say, we see it differently, but let me understand. You think we should structure it this way because of the other deals you've done in this space. So I think that we are sometimes hesitant to paraphrase. We do these very long exercises around active listening. And I remember doing it with a group of professionals in Paris a couple of years ago. It was business execs. We're doing an active listening exercise where they were supposed to paraphrase one another. And the exercise was, you, speaker, tell a story about something that's really important to you. Active listener, you paraphrase them to show how well you're listening. So one participant, this German guy, he talks about how he lives in a big city, but he talked about how much he loved hunting. And he liked to go out into the wilderness. No cell phones, be alone, it's quiet. I love hunting. And so we're now watching the person who tries to paraphrase this guy. And the active listener said, so you want to live in the woods? And I think that's what the struggle is around paraphrasing sometimes. We don't quite know how to repeat back. How could you show you're actively listening to the hunter guy without making an assumption that it actually isn't what he intended to communicate at all?
I would say
I love that answer. I would say hunting. Okay, is that inquiry? It is inquiry, but let me guess. You think it's a crazy thing to like.
no, you might perceive this as a crazy thing, but actually I think it might open up.
So it could. Sometimes if you misparaphrase people, it does get them to speak up to challenge you. I think the reason I guessed that you thought hunting was kind of a crazy thing was you said hunting. And I think that's the other thing. Like, I'm not a hunter, I'm not a big fan of hunting, and I might hear that story and think, so shooting animals is how you like to spend your free time, right? That would be more advocacy than inquiry or paraphrasing, right? And I think that is a challenge as well. When we don't like what the other person's saying, it hurts to paraphrase because we think they're wrong, and we want to tell them that they're wrong or immoral or whatever it might be. But paraphrasing, if you can tell the other side, I understand you, not necessarily agree with you, but, hunting isn't my sport, but I can see why just being away from cell phones, in the fresh air, away from the city, is a hobby for you, right? That's just a way of communicating. But what I've seen so often and is really interesting, we can talk about paraphrasing, it's pretty easy. Again, none of this stuff sounds like rocket science. In practice, it's surprisingly hard. I think that paraphrasing is a superpower that, if you're good at it, is surprisingly helpful in both building relationships and helping people believe that you understand their point of view without necessarily giving up your own interests. Okay, where's that? Anyone recognize it? I'll give you a hint. What's that thing in the middle? Paris. It's the Champs-Élysées. This is the story from a client that I think illustrates the connection between creating value and helpful listening skills. So it turns out that the client had an office building here on the Champs-Élysées, which is expensive real estate. And they had leased a building on the Champs-Élysées for 700 euros per meter for 5 years. And then there was a big market crash. Oh, by the way, there's a 2 million euro penalty for breaking the lease early. And then there was a market crash, and the other rents around dropped, but they were already locked into this long-term contract at 700 euros a square meter. So the company wanted out of the lease, but the owner said, if you're going to break the lease, I'm going to enforce the $2 million penalty. I don't care what's happening in the market. You signed a contract, contract's contract, that's the deal. So the partner and the associate went to meet with the company owner, and they tried to negotiate, and they basically said, yeah, market conditions have changed. It's almost force majeure. We should be able to get out of this contract. All the reasons why we should be able to break this particular deal. And the owner said, I'm trying to sell a building. No way am I going to let you out of this. I'm gonna fight you, and I'm going to make sure that I collect my $2 million if you're going to leave. So the partner was telling me this story. He said, you know, the associate was doing the arguing on why why under the law and under fairness we should be able to break the lease. They left the meeting with the owner being very upset and saying, I'm going to collect my $2 million if you guys break the lease. And the partner told the associate when they left the building, you weren't listening. You weren't listening to him. What do you think he didn't listen to, the associate? What do you think might have been motivating the owner?
The last line.
The last line, and what about it?
He may give him a discount just to keep them inside the building.
Yeah, and why do they want to keep him? I mean, why would you give a discount to keep them there?
Because we want to sell the building, so we want to see the building full.
Yeah, exactly. It's harder to sell a building where there's no tenants and it looks like it's hard to get tenants in the building than it is to have a full building with high quality. This is a very high profile company. So the owner wanted them there as he tried to sell the building to show the value of the real estate itself. So again, the owner said to the associate, like, this is a lesson for you in good negotiating skills. You're arguing for why we are right. Fine, that's part of what we do, but you missed an opportunity to actually do the deal by not listening to what his clients, what the owner's interests were. He wanted to sell the building. He wanted to make sure that high-profile clients were there. They met with the owner again, and they agreed to stay in the building for 300 euros a month for that 5-year period of time. A simple example, but again, I think it shows how often when we're busy advocating for our own point of view, we forget about listening carefully to what the interests of the other side are in order to be able to figure out if there's a different deal that can be done that adds value for both parties in the negotiation. Okay, so kind of in summary here are the most common mistakes that I see in negotiation that are related to that 7-element framework that we introduced at the beginning. The first is around relationship, not considering the impact of your own behavior on the relationship with the other side, right? I can bully you. If I know you're desperate, I can bully you, I can force you, I can assert my will against you, and maybe I can, but that comes at a cost to your relationship with the other side. And if the relationship is if either the relationship or your reputation matter, not being at least aware and cautious about your own behaviors, your own behavior on relationship is a mistake that too often happens in negotiation. We've already talked about it, but not asking more questions, not asking the follow-on questions, not summarizing for clarity, a big mistake that people often make in negotiation. Not thinking about your own interests, especially broadly, as well as the interests of the other side, is a common mistake. Not being open to creative solutions, not thinking about other ways of doing the deal. Is there a fruit peel that we can figure out in this negotiation? Is something that people often get stuck in. Legitimacy, again, that's standards and norms. Not doing research around what references, what standards, what benchmark, what legal precedent, what prior contracts support what I think our options should be, and not thinking about how the other side sees what is fair or legitimate is a common mistake. Not thinking about what you're going to do if you walk away, and not thinking about what they might do if they walk away, an error that is all too frequent. And around commitment, either not committing, not making sure that you both understand what you're agreeing to, or committing in such small increments that you can't step back and create a new package when you get further along in the negotiation. Those tend to be common mistakes. So what's the advice? And then I'll kind of open it up for us to chat. Understand the other side's point of view. I think, all of us know, put yourself in the shoes of the other party, understand that, yeah, that is good general advice, but then how do you do it? And I think one of the most powerful things you can do as a general practice is get used to writing down or typing out what are my key interests that I want to achieve in this negotiation, and what do I assume the other side's interests are. In a broad way, I assume they want to collect as much money as possible, but they also might want A, B, and C. There also might be an interest in sand that is at play at the table. Looking for a wide variety of interests, part of your preparation method for your negotiation, is a really helpful thing to get used to doing. And it can be relatively efficient in terms of time. What do they think is fair? Only going into negotiation saying, I got this one contract which is on point, I know this is what we should do in this particular situation, that's the only fair deal. It's missing an opportunity to consider what they might be seeing that makes them think a different approach is more fair. Let's see, what else? And then, again, thinking about what I'm going to do if I walk away. And is there a way I can make my walk away better? Can I improve the odds of my walk away being good? And what is their alternative? Should I ask questions about their alternative? Are there ways that I can make them think that walking away might not serve their interests? Those are good practice in negotiations as well. Don't underestimate the relationship. Look beyond positions for interests, think about creative options, and make sure you understand why you're at the negotiation table as well. Thank you. So, enough talking. How about any comments, questions, or things that are on your mind as we just open up this broad topic of negotiation?
Thank you, Linda. I will help to facilitate the questions. If you have one, please raise your hand and we will have microphones for you to ask any question you want, or some discussion or comment you would like to make.
Probably I will start
You
with...
can introduce yourself, yes.
My name is Oksana. I'm a product director at some company, and yeah, I'm working not with negotiations, but a lot of practice we are using in product management, especially being curious. So this is really cool to see how I can apply it to my own field. But my question about negotiations, because I'm really bad at this, and I've had this really great type of advice from Sheryl Sandberg, and she said especially for the negotiations for women, because usually we cannot negotiate for ourselves, because usually we think that we are not too good, you know, like something we are undervalued, our skills are not enough, especially for salary agreements. I mean, like, this is a very kind of vivid thing. So she gave this advice that you should negotiate for somebody else, for your friend. So which advice would you give when I negotiate for myself, or somebody from this audience negotiate for themselves, for the better kind of negotiation results for ourselves?
Yeah, great. Well, thanks for that question. Yeah, and so this is a common question, right? What are the gender impacts, and what are different ways that men and women negotiate? The problem is it's very hard to generalize. But in terms of, there are lots of research on this, and there's a book called Women Don't Ask, and it's about women not asking, which is why they titled the book that. And it's about the lack of the ability to kind of ask for more money for yourself, or ask for the promotion, or assert your own interests. The advice around, what's interesting about that is that women tend to not, you know, stereotyping, right? So this isn't true of all women, of course, but in general terms, there's a higher percentage of women that don't feel good, don't feel strong about or comfortable in asking for their own interests or asserting their own position. But women tend to do quite well, and when you do simulated negotiation, women tend to do as well as their male counterpart when they're acting as an advocate for someone else. So there's a kind of weird, I don't know, societal assumption that if I'm advocating for somebody else, that's okay. But if I'm asking for myself, that doesn't feel right. So and that's kind of Sandberg's advice as well, and I think it's borne out by a lot of studies, that if you can think about yourself, your own interests as legitimate, and think about how someone advocating for you would express them, that tends to help one be more confident in their negotiations as well. And it's true no matter what gender one has, is if you're uncomfortable in asking for things for yourself, if advocacy or assertiveness is not your thing, think about being an advocate. Think about how someone who was a good advocate or is a good advocate would represent your point of view, and try to channel that person. We do a long exercise with participants in the negotiation workshop, where we ask them to pick a skill that they think they need to work on, whether it's empathy and active listening or assertiveness. And it's amazing how you can work with people in an hour period of time where you ask them to advocate for themselves for a hard request. I mean, time off, a promotion, salary adjustment. And the baseline of how they do it at the beginning is very insecure, very halting, not clear at all what they're even asking for. And when you give people permission to practice and feedback that, why are you not being comfortable, and what are your interests, how can you make them clear to the other side, you see an amazing difference from the beginning to the end. And part of it is just believing in your own worth and your own ability to represent your own interests, not just the interests of other people.
I also ask as a moderator, so is there any tips and tricks on negotiating with Silicon Valley investor rich man world? Because it's a certain culture of talking to people in power, because the money and investment is obviously power. Is there any, recipes for that?
Yeah, so I actually, in preparing to come over here, I talked to a startup partner at Fenwick, who represents a lot of technology and life sciences startups at the law firm, and asked her, what do you see among your clients that are mistakes that startups make, particularly when they're looking for investors or venture capital funding? And one thing that she said she noticed is kind of the opposite of the lack of willingness to speak up for yourselves, and over assertiveness around asking for what they should get with venture capitalists. So she said, I see too many founders that fall in love with their own value and their own ideas, and then go to venture capital and say, I want this much money, I want founder shares, I want liquidated preferences. They go into the negotiation as if they were Mark Zuckerberg, as opposed to the people in the garage that may or may not have a good idea. And that over-assertiveness is sort of the opposite problem. When you ask for unreasonable things from venture capitalists, the investment people are putting risk in you, right, the founder. And if you're not willing to show that you're willing to take the risk as well, that you don't have to have absolute control, or that you also recognize the venture may or may not succeed in the long run, it turns them off immediately. And she said she's seen more deals fall apart by overly aggressive and overly confident founders than founders who are too insecure about their own value. Maybe it's a Silicon Valley thing, I'm not sure, but that seemed to be a bigger problem.
Thank you. Okay, so
Please.
Here.
My name is Julia. I'm leading HR function. My voice is pretty big.
No, we have a stream. That is why it's important to use the microphone.
Yeah, so I'm leading HR function at Symphony Solutions, and I wanted to ask, probably to pick on this question and to consider it further. So Linda, in your experience of negotiation, does cross-cultural component play a part when negotiating with cultures locally, and also in terms of building trust and taking it from there? So.
Absolutely. And I think it's one thing I'm particularly careful about, hopefully. When I go to someone else's culture, I'm not an expert in someone else's culture. I'm barely fluent in my own. So I think humility is a very important characteristic when you're operating in someone else's context or culture that's different from your own. For example, advice around, well, what kind of body language is positive in a negotiation? For many cultures, it's eye contact, it's nodding, but I've also worked in Asian cultures where it's not, right? There's less direct communication, and especially body language and eye contact. You can't give advice to the world if each context might be different. On the other hand, every single human being, no matter what context you're in, has interests, right? And so the tools are applicable I've worked with these tools all over the world, and I'm not an expert in any culture, but I think I know that it's important that you understand the interests of the parties you're negotiating with, including respecting their religion, their culture, their market, right? Their precedents. So in terms of how can you negotiate cross-culturally, it's using the same tools around active listening skills and trying to understand interests, and just realizing you might be less intuitively accurate about interests and legitimacy in a culture that's not your own.
Hi again.
Hi.
I think there is a need to explain what does it mean legitimacy and why it's so important. For example.
Yeah, and given that you are in the class, if I could ask you, how would you describe it?
Maybe a fair price that exists in the market, no matter what sides are in the negotiation. Yeah,
so the idea, that term legitimacy, and by the way, if other people were here teaching the course, they might use a different term. They might, actually in the book Getting to Yes, it talks about criteria or objective standards. The reason I like the word legitimacy instead of just criteria or objective standards is there are some contexts in which there isn't a purely objective standard. I suspect that here in Ukraine you have something similar to what we have, which is called Kelly Blue Book, KBB.com, which is you have something else I'm sure, but you put in, if you're selling a used car.
Afteria.
Exactly, that's
very
what I was thinking.
Close.
So the idea is you go online to that website You put in the year of your car, how many miles or how many kilometers it has, what condition it's in, and it magically spits out a number telling you the value of your car. That's objective. That's an objective standard, right? I went to the website, I put in the facts, and the objective criteria is X number of euro or whatever. The problem is so many negotiations, and I'm sure you've seen this in your own world as well, don't have a particular one reference point for what is the objective standard. When you're buying a house, what market conditions, what do you look for in order to figure out how much you should pay for the house? Location, but how do you figure out how much to pay? How do you figure out how much that house is worth? Benchmark, market price. That's legitimacy. So here's why don't you just use the word criteria then, or objective standard? I think, imagine this, you're trying to hire a consultant, and you don't have access to any of the contracts for what someone else has paid that consultant. But you talk to someone who said, I worked with that consultant and they saved us $100,000 just on what their advice is. Is that reference on how valuable the consultant was helpful for you in deciding how much you want to pay for them? It doesn't tell you exactly what you should pay for them, but does it add legitimacy to that consultant? Credibility, but that's the idea, right? So the concept of legitimacy is the concept of fairness, reasonableness, justification, and most of us, I bet every one of us in this room wants to be fairly treated in a negotiation, but what a fair answer is a hard element, and that's the notion of legitimacy. I might see this standard as the appropriate one, you might see a different standard, but at least if we get those out there, we know the range in which we're operating, and then we can figure out if we can close the gap or make a deal. If you are forced into a deal that you don't think is fair or legitimate, what's the danger? What's the danger in being the person that traps somebody else into doing a deal that isn't fair? It won't last long, right? It's hard to enforce or get people to stick to a deal if they feel the deal was not fair. So understanding what other people see as fairness in a negotiation is particularly important if you want the deal to last. Is that we've been working on this issue of legitimacy in the class a lot, and it's a harder concept to put into practice than it is to talk about.
What if there is no enough legitimacy on the market, or not enough benchmarks on the market, or there is a disbalance of information in these two sides?
So maybe let me give you an example, and you give me advice. Because I'm thinking about a context in which there's not one clear standard on what the appropriate, fair, legitimate number should be. So this is back to a number of years ago when I had my consulting business. Well, my consulting business is the primary thing I did besides teaching a class. And one of my clients was Fenwick. And but they were one of many clients. So I would work with them. They're in where I live in Silicon Valley, but I also did a lot of work all over the world. I got tired at some point of, San Francisco is a pretty nice place to live, I live closer to Palo Alto. It's a nice place to live, and I was never home. I was never there because I was on the road all the time. So I decided at a certain point in my career, I wanted to have a little bit more time just in the Bay Area where I live. I had talked to a friend of mine who also did work similar to me, but he said, hey, I just struck a deal with one of my clients that I'm on retainer, which means that now they are my primary client. They pay me a fixed amount of money, and they are my first obligation. So I can still do other work, but I know every year I'm going to get X number of dollars from this particular client, and they are first choice, so that I'm going to serve their interest before I use other interests. Does the concept of retainer make sense? Is that clear? Pay you a retainer and you're my priority. So I thought about that and I thought, that's kind of a good idea. And one of my primary clients was Fenwick. And I was doing on and off projects with them, with their lawyers, with their partners, doing everything from coaching associates to sexual harassment prevention training, which is not one of the most fun things to do with partners in a law firm. But I decided I'd like to do more work with them and less work than just sporadic clients all over the place. So how do I decide? I went to them and proposed the idea of, how about you put me on retainer and you all are my first choice, no more of these one-off contracts, and I'll do more of the work. I can do this for you, I can do negotiation training, I can work as a mentor. And they said, we like the idea. Okay, so we have a general concept now. How do I decide what to charge? This is back to, why am I telling this story? It's back to there's not a market standard. How do you decide what a legitimate price is for them to pay me on an annual basis?
You're counting what you was having from another project.
Okay, so I could look at other projects, or maybe even projects with them. I could look at, what was the money that I had billed them as a client. The problem with that as a benchmark for me was they were one of many clients. So if they just look at what fees I was charging them, that wasn't enough to keep me dedicated to them as my primary client. But, I'm sorry? That was the problem though, right? They were one of many clients. And so the number didn't look big enough for me to give up the rest of my practice to just dedicate myself to them.
But you have also to imagine why it must be interesting for them.
Yeah, and why would it be interesting to them?
What amount must be interesting for them?
Yes, fair enough. Yeah, it has to be something that feels legitimate to them. And again, it's going to be more work than what I had done in the past. It's going to be a broader range because I'm going to be dedicating more of my time to working with them. We'd already had, the other thing to know is we had a very good working relationship. I knew Ralph, the licensing partner. I knew a lot of the partners. They had me do other work there. I respected them. They respected me. It was a good working relationship. Now, so all that's good, creating value, right? We're going to have this retainer agreement. The challenge is we're now in distribution. How much are you going to pay me? And that's where it's hard. There isn't one standard. And it also feels like the more dangerous part of a relationship when you're saying, give me this amount of money. So I thought long story short, I thought about it a lot, and I talked to my friend who had suggested it to me. I said, hey, how did you decide what to charge your client? And by the way, his practice is similar to mine, except for he's not a lawyer. So he does a lot of the same kind of work, but he's not a lawyer. And I knew his client, though, was a legal consulting company, so not that different than a law firm. And I said, what are you getting? He actually offered. He actually volunteered how much he was paid on retainer. And I liked that number a lot. So I said to him, can I use you as a reference point for proposing what I think a good number would be for my law firm? And he said, sure. And then I went. Now, by the way, should I make the first offer or should I ask them to say how much they want to pay me?
You should be first.
Why?
Because you can ensure the higher price. Obviously, they're already motivated, and you can get as much money as the most motivated buyer are there on the market.
Okay, so in the concept, many of you probably heard the concept of anchoring. And the concept, it's a well-studied psychological phenomenon and something that you see in negotiation. And the concept of anchoring is that the first number that's put out in a negotiation tends to have an anchoring effect, right? A strong effect on where deals end up. Usually because the anchor is tied to something fair or reasonable, but sometimes in the absence of knowing what's fair or reasonable, a random number can have an anchoring effect as well. And here's an example. There was a study done a number of years ago with, I think it was United States college students, and they separated the college students into two separate rooms. And each room had a roulette wheel. Roulette wheel, does that make sense? A wheel you spin and it stops on a number. So each room had a roulette wheel in it, and they posed a question to the students, which was, what percentage of countries in the United Nations are African? And this is US college students, so you can be pretty sure they didn't know. And then they asked the question and they spun the wheel, and in one room, it stops at a very low number, and in another room, it stopped at a very high number, and the responses in the room with the high number guessed much higher percentages than the room where the roulette wheel stopped at a low number. And it's probably painfully obvious that the roulette wheel number has nothing to do with the percentage of countries in Africa that are, the percentages of countries in the UN that are African, but in the absence of information, that anchoring number has a powerful psychological effect. So back to your comment on why I should go first, same thing plays out in negotiation, right? If the first number is either fair or reasonable, or at least has some justification tied to it, it tends to have a powerful anchoring effect. And deals tend to end up in that zone. Not always, right? Because if people are familiar with the concept of anchoring and they have a different anchor that they also feel is strong, they put that down. But at least then you know the zone in which you're operating. Okay, so I can anchor by putting the first number out, putting out a general negotiation advice is if you have to go first, put out the best number for yourself that you can give rationale or legitimacy to. Not just the highest crazy number you can give, that often backfires, but the best number you can give for yourself that you can tie to some source of legitimacy or reasonableness. So I can anchor. Anyone think I should ask them to make the first offer to me?
Most companies in Ukraine, we are not doing it in such way. We are proposing numbers.
And you wouldn't do it in Ukraine? You wouldn't propose a number to a potential...
We are proposing mostly. We are not waiting.
You are not waiting?
Yeah.
And why is that? What's the business cultural context for that?
It's cultural thing, I believe. Like, when you are trying to deal the best and like to make the best deal, you need to initiate this one.
The number, okay.
Yes.
What's interesting is, in most negotiation programs, if you ask people, do you want to put the offer out first, or do you want to wait till the other side gives an offer? Usually, there's a higher percentage of people that want the other side to go first. Why is that? Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking as well about that. You already told that it's better to go first and put the number, but I was thinking if there is no benchmark, and for them they probably also don't know what numbers should be, and they don't have a friend who has this or other. Maybe they were also talking to other law firms who have their lawyers on retainer, and maybe they've heard of higher numbers, and maybe they can offer you the pretty much number you will be satisfied with, and they wouldn't expect you to. So I don't know, if there is no benchmark, so it's a kind of, in my opinion, tricky thing, because
I totally agree. I don't in any way claim that the best advice is to go first. I think, again, lawyers' favorite phrase, it depends. But I think if you have a very strong anchor that you think they might not be aware of, I think going first makes a lot of sense, because then at least you can set the expectations of the range in which you want to negotiate. If you don't know, but you think they might have access to, they might have a number that you at least want to understand, then having them go first can be a perfectly good choice. I don't think there's a right answer. I think it's, particularly if you're worried that they might underestimate a source of legitimacy and anchor that you have, then I, in general, would say go first. In the absence of information, I often want the other side to go first just so that I can learn what they're thinking. In this particular situation, I thought I was the one who proposed that we do this thing. So just kind of as a general norm, if I'm the one doing it, maybe it makes sense for me to say how much I think that the particular offer should be. I've used this story with some people like, it's a law firm, you should let them go first because maybe they're going to throw a whole bunch more money at you than you expected. Maybe, I doubt it. But what I did know, and that's the other thing we talk a lot about in negotiation. If you measure success by you got the best possible deal that any human being on the face of the earth could get, you're going to always be disappointed. Your measure of success should be, did I meet my own interests well Is it fair so that it's durable? Is it better than my BATNA? Did I not wreck the relationship in the way I negotiated? Is it a deal that captures interest? Those are the ways of measuring whether or not your negotiation outcome was successful, not, I got the best deal. You know, it's not the art of the deal. I'm the best negotiator in the world and you should do everything I do. That's not my definition of successful negotiation. It is, did you meet your interests better than your BATNA? Creative option, fair. So, what I decided to do was to use my friend's number as the number that I was happy with. I knew that if I'd be satisfied with that, I still could do some other consulting work and have this comfortable, like I know how much I'm going to be getting from this particular client, and I don't have to take every gig in Peoria, Illinois in the middle of February. I can stay in San Francisco. So I went to them and I said, I have a colleague. He's doing a retainer much like this. He's not a lawyer, but here's what he does. Same kind of things as me. His name is such and such. He's happy to have you contact him if you like. And I obviously cleared it with my friend so that he was okay being a reference if they just chose to check my legitimacy. And they said, okay, that was it. Now, some people would say, see, you should have had them go first because maybe that'd get me more money. I don't care. I know that my reference point was one that made me happy. It was definitely fair and one that worked out well in the end. The last quick story I'll give around legitimacy is, fast forward a number of years. Okay, don't send this video to my employer, by the way. I worked with Fenwick for a number of years as a consultant, and then Flex by Fenwick needed a new manager. And I knew what the salary of the previous manager was, and there was a problem with the previous manager being smart, but not a good manager of people. And so I was taking over a team of people that were really smart and really good, but very, there was a lot of tension because of what had happened with the prior leadership. So I'm going into the negotiation knowing what the previous manager made. And I went to my future boss, who's the chief financial officer of the law firm, and I said, look, I know what person X was making, and I know that I can do a better job of managing. The team already knew me. I'd been doing some consulting work with them. We had a really kind of good vibe going. And so I said, I know what person X was getting, so I would like to target this. And I don't know about this guy, how much negotiation experience he had, but he said the following to me. He said, Linda, if you're going to compare yourself to person X, you should ask for 3 times what they were making. But there's not that money in the budget. There's no way the law firm's going to approve that. So this is what we can give you. And I remember thinking, that is a smart negotiation move right there, because he just complimented me like crazy and didn't give me what he said I could ask for. So to this day, I think that's a really smart negotiation. And it was a fine number, but I thought, what a brilliant way of saying, yeah, in a pure legitimacy sense, you might deserve that, but in terms of factual dollars, that's not what we can do for you. The creating value piece was, I said 2 things. Okay, fair enough, that's reasonable. 2 things I would like. I just signed an agreement to teach a class at Harvard Law School in January for 3 weeks. I'd like to be able to do that and still be employed by you, even though I'm going off to work for a university for 3 weeks. And he said, okay. And I said, I also have a 45-minute commute to downtown San Francisco, which is a nightmare. There's no public transportation that gets close to my house and close to where my office is. Parking in San Francisco is pretty ugly expensive. I'd like to have a parking spot in the building, if that's okay with you. And he said yes to that. So, yeah, could you give me 3 times the salary of the prior person? No, but can you give me something that are relatively low cost to him and really high value to me? that's the deal that we worked out.
I think we have to take one or two last questions. Yeah, please. And
thank you. Yeah, thank you, Linda, very much for the insights. So my name is Irina. I'm leading business development at Juristic. So I do follow a lot of negotiations, and I really liked your point that it's very important not just to get to what you want in negotiations, but also be able to end it well and go away well and nicely. So my question is, maybe you could share some tips and maybe your stories, how you managed to go away from the negotiations at some point, but people kept in very good relationships with you, and then they were willing to come back when their situation changed, and they were willing to refer you for the future.
Yeah, thanks. And is the question about when you have to walk away and don't get a deal, but you preserve the relationship, or you get a deal which also has a good relationship that means you can negotiate again? Does that question make sense? I'm trying to figure out whether you're saying, how do you negotiate when you actually walk away and don't get a deal, but preserve the relationship? That's one. So I'll answer that question first. I think, if you negotiate fairly, if you're transparent but not vulnerable or giving up too much in the negotiation, if you respect other people's interests, other people's perceptions of what's legitimate, what their needs are and what their baton is, in general, that means you're going to have a relationship. People will respect working with you and want to work with you again. Think about someone you've negotiated with that you think they're a bully. They tend to get the best deal for themselves and they could care less about you. Those are not the people that you want to negotiate with again, right? So it's pretty simple. Treat people the way, not the way you would want to be treated, but the way they would want to be treated, and you tend to have good relationships in negotiation. When you walk away, I think it's how you walk away is a very important skill. We do this exercise called the yes, no, yes exercise, and it's come from a book that's written by Bill Urey. So Bill Urey was the co-author of Getting to Yes. His first book is Getting to Yes. Then he wrote a book called Getting Past No. And then more recently, within the last decade, he wrote a book called The Power of Positive No. So just think about how much money that guy has made on yes and no over the course of his lifetime. But the power of positive no, it's kind of simple, but it's surprising, as a consultant who works with people on practically putting things into practice. I'm not an academic. My approach is, how do you make this stuff applicable in real negotiations? So this is to your point about how you walk away from a negotiation while keeping the door open to a positive relationship in the future. So the yes, no, yes model is kind of 3 steps. The first yes is at least a mental yes, even if you don't say it out loud. It's that I believe in my own interests and I'm going to advocate for them, and I believe in my own legitimacy. I believe that what I'm asking for, or the reference point I'm using, is fair. That's the first yes. If you aren't convinced that your own interests are legitimate, or that the reference point you're using is legitimate, for most people, it's very hard to advocate effectively for yourself if you don't buy your own story. So the first yes is buy your own story. Believe in your own story. The no is, can you clearly communicate to the other side that whatever they put on the table, you're going to have to walk away from? And the example of how that's hard for people, worked with a consulting company for a number of years, where we worked with young associates on saying no to a client that was asking them something they had to say no to. But it's a professional services organization. They don't like saying no. So we would role play with people where they had to tell no to the client. The client was asking for something that was unreasonable. And it was amazing how they couldn't say no. They would say things like, gee, that would be kind of difficult. When you hear someone say, gee, that would be kind of difficult, does that mean no? No, it means it's negotiable, right? So, okay, ain't impossible, so then we'll force the issue a bit more. So just getting clarity around no is the second part of the yes, no, yes framework. Clearly communicating no. It can be respectful, but just, I'm sorry, we cannot do that. It's against our policy. We can't meet cash flow if we do that. Whatever it is, right? You give a clear no. That option is off the table. And here's the relationship building or relationship preserving second yes, which is now put on the table an option to which you could say yes, that you also think meets their interest. Now, again, just talking about this concept just maybe sounds kind of common sense, but when you're in a challenging negotiation where you're about to say no and walk away, having a mental model of how to communicate that in an effective way is surprisingly helpful. Yes to your own story, a clear no, but putting on the table an option that you could say yes to if they are willing to say yes to you.
Thank you very much, and here is the last one, I think.
My name is Lydia. I'm leading HR function in Lviv City Council. And I have a question about emotions, maybe some advices. How do you manage emotions if you faced a situation when one of the sides is quite, maybe it's not connected with aggressivity, but anyway, emotions.
Yeah, and it's a very hard thing to control in negotiations, right? Any of us think that we're not guided by our emotions or just not being honest with how human beings operate. So the idea with emotions is not that you can control them necessarily, but the more you're aware of how they're impacting you, the better you can have strategic choices about how to respond in a negotiation. Here's why. Remember the 7-element model. Here's why, as a law student, I remember thinking, frameworks, models, that's all good and well for you academic folks. But what does it mean in the real world? Here's what it means in the real world to me. When I get triggered, almost all of us will get triggered in an emotion, in a negotiation. And you can think about the three dangerous E's, the letter E of negotiation. It's ego, emotions, and escalation. So if you threaten my identity, my ego, it often provokes negative emotions, and now I'm willing to fight, right? And that's when disputes escalate or we walk away from a deal. So what's the best advice? It is not to deny that the emotions are there, but to be aware of when you're being triggered, and then to be very conscious about how you're going to respond. In general, if we just go with our gut instinct when we're triggered emotionally, it tends to be fight or flight, and that usually is not the best response, right? So when triggered, it reminds me early in my consulting career, a partner said, if it feels good, don't do it. And I think that's part of what emotions are for us, right? Like when we get mad or we want to just get even with them, we often behave in a way that doesn't serve our own interests well for that short-term ability to fight back at you. So first step, again, it's kind of easy to say, hard to do, but be aware of when it's happening and don't react. Our instincts serve us well when we're trying to escape the saber-toothed tiger. When we're trying to negotiate, our instinct often does not necessarily serve us well. And then have a framework, whatever it is for you, right? What is your strategy? What is your way of organizing your thinking that helps you stay present while not getting triggered by the emotion? Whether it's something like, okay, I hate this guy, but I know what my interests are. I can't walk away from him, so I don't want to get provoked. I need to just say, okay, that's frustrating for me to hear, but let's stay and try to make this deal. Here's what I think we can do. So it's a complicated question that you ask, but I think the more we're aware of what triggers us and the more we have our own mental model for how we're going to be rational and strategic in the face of an irrational or emotional provocation, the better chances we have to stay grounded toward what are our interests, what's my bad nut, and how do I say yes to something that's better than walking away. Or if it's better to walk away, there's certain contexts, I'm well aware of where I am in the world, where walking away is what you have to do because the other side is not a rational or reasonable negotiator. And those are those situations where that makes sense as well.
Thank you very much, Linda. It was an amazing opportunity for us. So just a small fact, thanks to this lecture and all of your contribution, we were able to collect more than 60, almost 70,000 hryvnias to the Foundation of Oleg Vorobyev. So thank you for all of your contributions, generous contributions. Thank you for this lecture and this event happened. Thank you very much for coming to Ukraine. This is a great pleasure to host you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity with you. Thank you.
Have a nice evening.